My favorite philosopher of all time, after myself, of course, it is Aristotle. I say this even though I am more Platonic than Aristotelian in my thinking. At any rate, it is beyond question that Aristotle is ridiculously important in the history of philosophy. And while Aristotle himself was not a Christian, his philosophy was fundamental in that of subsequent apologists for the Christian faith. The primary Platonic apologist was St. Augustine, and the primary Aristotelian apologist was St. Thomas Aquinas. The first thing to note about Aristotle is that he is the founding father of formal logic. While not creating logic, he was the first to discover it and or formally spell out how it works. Classical apologetics would have been impossible without logic. It would be impossible. Classical apologetics is impossible without logic. So just a very, very brief surface examination of Aristotelian logic. Aristotelian logic revolves around the concept of the syllogism. For example, Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. Conclusion 3, therefore Socrates is mortal. This sounds suspiciously similar to the Kalam argument as popularized by Dr. Craig, doesn't it? Anyhow, in a syllogism, there is a major premise and a minor premise. The middle term in our example is man, the word man or men. The conclusion follows inescapably from the premises. Aristotle spells out his logic in certain of his books, namely that body of work which has come to be called the Organon. The Organon was essentially the complete word on logic until the advent of symbolic logic in relatively modern times, I believe in the 1800s. So we're talking about over 2,000 years. All that anybody had to say about logic was already written in the Organon, more or less. Next, in Aristotle's philosophy, he spoke of unmoved movers. The world is eternally old, he taught, but it is in motion. The motion in the world points to an unmoved mover, or God. Aristotle used motion, then, to deduce the existence of a God, just like Aquinas would do after him. The term motion is better translated by the word change. The proof for God's existence in Aristotle's metaphysical writings, then, is essentially as follows. There is change in the world. Change requires a changer, someone to make the change happen. We cannot have an infinite regress of changers. There must therefore be a changeless changer. So a mover, one who moves other things but is not himself moved. So God exists. It is important to realize that the God of Aristotle is very different from the God of Christianity. But later Christians were able to adapt his theistic proof, Aristotle's, to establish the existence of a God who is compatible with Christianity. So they use Aristotle to prove the Christian God. Alright, so Aristotle died, and about 300 years after that, Christ came on the scene. Jesus was crucified, then he rose from the dead, and then in about 100 AD, the followers of Jesus died off. At that time, the patristic period of the church started. Now, many of the fathers in the patristic church were philosophically minded. They used Hellenistic philosophy to defend their faith. So let's back up and see what Hellenistic philosophy is. In the years since Plato and Aristotle, there hadn't been much new philosophy. What had happened was that people took Plato and Aristotle, mashed them together, and came up with various kinds of neo-Aristoplatonism. but the fathers lean more towards Plato than Aristotle. In contrast, the Middle Ages lean more towards Aristotle. So then, the fathers in the patristic period use Plato to defend their faith, with perhaps a little bit of Aristotle thrown in for good measure. So in the next profile, Apologist profile, we are going to look at Paul the Apostle in the New Testament. Shalom.